Uh, yes, so following on from Geshe Zopa's teachings here in July, so this is the second round of unpacking some of, or at least going into slightly more detail on some of the topics that Geshe taught as requested by Geshe to do. So previously we looked at the intro to Tantra, and now looking at the philosophical view, the Buddhist philosophy, which is quite a huge topic in itself. So I'll just be dropping little bits and to see how we go with that. So we have, so this week and next week. So we'll see how far we go. So we have our flower bearers are coming in to make offerings. So wonderful to see. So from, the Buddha taught the three wheels of Dharma. And so from that, from the different turnings came, you could say, different schools associating with the different turnings. So the first turning of the wheels on the Four Noble Truths, and that becomes a common foundation for all the Buddhist schools. But then, there are some schools who focus just on those teachings as the extant teachings of the Buddha. And so following the Buddhist sutras and so forth, saying this is the Buddha's teachings. And then the second turning was on the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. So particularly bringing in the very refined, we would say, Mahayana view of emptiness. Of course, emptiness is there in the Four Noble Truths, but elaborating more in detail. And knowing that, as the Buddha taught, according to the mental disposition of the, shall we say, target audience, it doesn't mean others weren't there, but those for whom that was. And it's like that thing, you don't start in kindergarten getting university level teachings. You sort of start at a kindergarten level. So I'm not suggesting those people are in kindergarten by any means, because compared to the other, sort of the Brahmin tradition and philosophical views at the time, it was very, very advanced. So what was unique about the Buddha's teachings, Lama Tsongkhapa, just like we recited in that praise to the Buddha, the Lama Tsongkhapa composed a text in praise of dependent arising and praising the Buddha, because it was the Buddha who uniquely taught dependent arising or dependent origination. The fact that everything is interdependent seems so obvious to us at one level, but it gets to more and more subtle levels, which are not at all obvious to us at all. Although perhaps I always like to think COVID has helped us with that, because something that's a hidden phenomena had a huge impact on the whole world, right? Hidden in terms of, now we've got an image of it blown up like this, but some sort of microscopic bug. Anyway, so there are slightly hidden and then more hidden phenomena. And it said whatever is to be known is known by a Buddha. So very interesting, like at the time, the Buddha actually talked about the earth being round long before, who was it, Copernicus, or what was the other one, Galileo, whichever one, I always forget which one did which bit, long before that. And what was interesting was the Dalai Lama grew up in Tibet, isolated from all these different worldviews, but yet had access to the Buddha's teachings. And somehow along the way, Tibet had grown up in this culture of the world was flat. The world was flat. But of course, then His Holiness is observing through his telescope, just like Galileo, and going, no, it's not, because I'm watching the trajectory. And it's logically, it's showing me that the earth is round. So there are a few other things, like this. The Buddha said, don't take anything I say just because I say it. Don't take it out of blind faith. You check it up, you analyze, you check for yourself. And the analogy used of like a goldsmith would, want to make sure they got the real deal. They haven't got fake gold. That's the real thing. And so they burn it and they melt it and they rub it and so forth to check that. And the Buddha said, do the same with my teachings, really analyze, take it apart. And if you can prove something wrong, chuck it out, right? Which was very interesting because I was watching this program about, they were diving down the Marianas Trench. That's the lowest point that we know of in the ocean. Because the Buddha in one of the sutras says there's no being that has gone to the bottom of the great ocean. Now, it may be that there's a further bottom beyond that, but when they were diving down, they saw other life forms as well. Plus you had the diver and the person operating the camera and whoever else was there. So it's interesting, the Buddhist, but it wasn't like a teaching. It was just an analogy used. So in any case, I like to read it and read the text and go, now, can I refute anything there? So far, I haven't been able to refute anything. Most of the time, I don't understand it. So let alone refute it. As I've discovered, in Tibetan Buddhism, we have this, and this is related to taking apart the Buddhist teachings, this system of debate, which is about logic and reasoning. And it's not like the parliamentary debate where you have people trying to knock the other one down. It's if I posit something and you say, oh, that doesn't pervade. So I'll give you an example of what happened to me with Venerable Rabina. Those of you know Venerable Rabina, she's like this. But she was at Vajrayana Institute and she said, Tony Steele, who's the director, and he's been the director for a long time, is Vajrayana Institute. And so I debated and say, no, because Vajrayana Institute is this and these and these and these and these. So you say, that doesn't pervade. So your reasoning's faulty, right? So I won that debate. I won one debate. There wasn't a comeback from that. So it's good to not just take what people say at face value. I mean, don't argue with your friends all the time, but you're trying to show the other person where they haven't considered something so that you're helping them refine their view. Right? So this is, so for that purpose, we studied what we call Buddhist tenets. Now, the whole topic of tenets is a huge topic, way beyond what we're going to touch on, but it does outline the views and so forth of the four major four major schools of Buddhism, which of course all have sub-schools and sub-schools and whatever. So why we study Buddhist philosophy is, maybe others have had this experience of it, and I've had it many times where people say, is Buddhism a philosophy? Yes. Is it a science? Yes. Is it a psychology? Yes. Is it a religion? Yes. So people have the view that, well, if it's any one of the others, it can't be a religion. If it's a religion, it can't be any one of the others. But I think all faiths have that interrogation of truth, which presents their philosophical view, right? Now, they're not the only philosophical views in the world. I heard that when they have a philosopher, is anyone a philosopher here? You probably all are. When they have a philosophers' conference, the only thing they agree on is that they disagree with each other because they've all got different views. So why we study, the first teaching of the Buddha was on the Four Noble Truths, the fact that we suffer. Because why? Because we're out of sync with reality, that we don't understand reality as it is. So these four major Buddhist schools progressively studied that, interrogated that truth, Before the Buddha taught, he spent many years, they call it seekers after truth, that were, like he was of the Brahmin caste. So at that point in time, only those of the Brahmin caste could follow, could do this, be seekers of the view, or, have access to philosophical views and so forth. So he was very much coming out of that, shall we say, Hindu tradition. As my Hindu friends remind me, Buddha was a Hindu. I know. Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, Buddha was a Hindu. Yeah, anyway. So all these four schools, examined that and expounded their own views on dependent arising, on reality, and on this topic of emptiness, which is the flip side of dependent arising, concepts around that. And so in so doing, each school bit by bit refined their understanding on the ultimate view of reality. And so through the debates of these different schools, it was also the case that at the time of the Buddha, there were also what are called the Tirthikas, or in Sanskrit, the non-believers or so forth, non-Buddhist philosophers. And the Buddha was requested at one point to challenge them. Anyway, so what would happen is if you won the debate, everyone else had to convert to your faith. The others had to convert to your faith. So many became Buddhist. Not because they went, oh, the Buddha must be right, but they realized that the Buddha had something that they wanted because they were genuinely seeking the truth. So the final view of reality is that expounded by the school in which we belong, which is the what we call Prasangika, Madhyamika, so middle way consequence school, so middle way, between extremes. I always like to say everything's middle way. My tea's middle way. I do say my tea's middle way, but it reminds me of it. Not too strong, not too weak, not too milky, not too. Anyway, just a joke. So basically, through understanding reality, we become our own liberators. We become free of the afflicted views, the deluded views that we hold currently. Okay, so all the Buddhist teachings basically come down to two aspects. One is the philosophical view of reality, of emptiness, of reality, of how things exist. And the other one is, in terms of practice, is do no harm. As the Buddha, all of the teachings were, do not engage in non-virtue, engage in virtue, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is a teaching of the Buddha. So basically, we're getting to understand the philosophical view, but how do we apply that in practice and engage in practice of, first of all, non-harm, as the Buddha said. At least don't harm, and if you can, be of benefit to others. And so to be of benefit to others is what we follow in the Mahayana path. Okay, right. So, the first school, or at least we talk about, as Mahayanas, we talk about Hinayana and Mahayana. And Hinayana literally means like lesser vehicle or lower vehicle. And the Maha is the great, Mahayana vehicle, great vehicle. So we divide in this way. But at the time of the Buddha, or not at the time of the Buddha, what developed post the Buddha out of that first turning of the wheel, there were 18 different sub-schools of that, of which one, and the one that has survived today, is Theravadan. So that school was one of many. So they're not the same. When we say Hinayana, it's not saying Theravadan. They are within those sub-schools. Anyway, so it gets more complicated than that. So usually the Theravadan lineage that we are aware of today, and that is alive and well in WA, is traced back to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century. So what happened after Buddha taught is that those immediate disciples, and you've got to think, first of all, there were only 5 spread out in different directions and established Buddhism in different parts. So these days, just to say that term Hinayana it's advised that we don't use that term because we don't want to say, oh, then it's not a hierarchy, because, you know, as a Mahayanas, we treasure and study all the Buddhist teachings, because the Buddha taught the whole path to enlightenment, and it's like you can't leave anything out. And this is another reason why we study all the different other schools. It's just like, well, why do we have to study all these different schools? And when you study them in depth, which happens in the basic program in more depth there, every school you go through, I think, I must be one of them. I must be one of them. I must be one of them. I think I'm one of them. Because you see where our thinking is exactly the same. And so, you know, so this is to help clarify that. So the idea of studying all the different schools is to deepen our understanding of all the Buddha's teaching, but in particular teachings on emptiness that come from the Buddha. Okay. So I mentioned that the first turning of the wheel is the basis of Theravadan practice, it's the basis of all Buddhist practice. And the second turning of the wheel is, which is on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which in its sort of essence form we have in these prayers, the Heart Sutra. People will be familiar with also Vajrakata or Diamond Cutter Sutra, for example, which are, you know, short sutras from the whole Prajnaparamita Sutras, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And there's a monk at Kopan who used to be in the US when I was at Rinpoche's house in Aptos in California. He was writing out in gold those verses of the 80,000 verses. He's still writing it out. It's a life job in pure gold. So he'd get up every morning and melt the gold. And I remember at the time, this was 2008, and I looked at the price of gold and thought, oh, no, I can't afford that. And now I look at it and go, no, I can't afford that. Anyway, so we can support him doing that. Why? In pure gold and on acid-free paper, because gold doesn't disintegrate, right? So this Lama Zopa Rinpoche's idea that you put it on, you write in pure gold, and those letters, in a way, are preserved. Even you could say even the paper goes, the gold doesn't go. Anyway, it's I think, you know, the more we understand the philosophical views of the Buddha, it blows your mind, you know, more and more. Blows apart our sort of holding on to things to be a certain way, because it's saying things aren't like that. And so at the third turning of the wheel then was looking at the emptiness as analysed by both what we would say Theravada and Mahayana schools. Okay. So the fundamental point of the philosophical view of emptiness is that we would say that that nothing exists inherently, truly, objectively, independently from its own side. So getting an understanding that everything that exists independence on, we say, causes and conditions. So at that level, everybody agrees to that. You know, when they went searching for, was it case 0 of COVID, it was looking for, well, what caused COVID? What conditions were there? You know, was it in that wet market? And so forth and so forth. I don't know if they ever got to the bottom of it, but looking for that to try and get what causes and conditions allowed this to arise. And actually, even before COVID, the epidemiologist had presented this model to a politician saying, almost like we're due for a pandemic, it's going to happen and we have to be prepared. And so we can model it and posit what might happen in the future. Similarly, the Buddha posited a lot about what might happen in the future. One of the things he posited that I refer to a lot is in the Golden Light Sutra, the chapter on the inviolable rights of kings. If we take kings to be world leaders, so basically saying, step up, take responsibility. But the Buddha also warned that if, let's say, world leaders allowed criminality in the land, allowed, unethical behavior, crops cease to flourish, and talked about the environmental results of that. And we see that playing out today, both of those things playing out today. Because, particularly, we talk about in Tibetan Buddhism about the balance of the elements. So the elements within the body and the elements externally, both, if they're out of whack, then we have all sorts of, like internally, ailments, physical and mental ailments, and we see those increasing in the world. Externally, increased environmental degradation, conflict, we see all that. A couple of days ago, I was at this first national conference on social cohesion. Why is there a national conference on social cohesion? Because social cohesion is falling apart. And so looking at, sort of how can we, actually, interestingly, one of the points I came away with newly, that all levels of government have a responsibility to make sure resentment doesn't take hold in their community. All levels of government have that responsibility. Very interesting, isn't it? So we now have a National Office of Social Cohesion. We've got special envoys for social cohesion, particularly in relation to what's happening in Gaza. And so one Israeli and one Palestinian holding those particular roles at this point in time. So it's because we see this social fabric is very tenuously, or maybe not entirely falling apart, but there's a growing lack of ethics in society. And the Buddha predicted that if we don't engage, let's say, in virtue, in wishing to benefit others and so forth. So it's really a critical time. So coming back to the philosophical view, as I mentioned, the school that we follow, we say that out of the Tibetan schools, we follow the Gelugpa school, and that means we follow Lama Tsongkhapa here. And Lama Tsongkhapa took the earlier teachings on the middle way consequence prasangika school set out by Arya Nagarjuna in the 3rd century, and then Lama Rinpoche in the 11th century, and Lama Tsongkhapa in the 13th century. You're finding, so what Lama Tsongkhapa did was look at all the different views on emptiness, particularly in that 3rd volume of the Great Treatise on the Path to Enlightenment, and honed that down to say, they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, they've over-negated, or they've under-negated, or they've missed this, or they've missed that. Again, not to be critical, but to show how you can make have the correct philosophical view. So when we talk about the correct philosophical view of emptiness, we say that, let's say dependent arising. So dependent arising, we can say, is the conventional truth, and emptiness is the ultimate truth that arises. The emptiness of the vase arises when the vase arises, and the emptiness of the flowers, fake as they are, arise. I'm just saying they last a bit longer. I don't know. I might be able to. When is it not a flower? Yeah, I can do that trick. Or I'm not going to do it either, but I could take this robe apart thread by thread. You say, the yellow robe. Of course, I don't want to take it apart because it's blessed. But you take it apart or anything apart, and you say, at which point is it no longer that object, you know? So it's made up of all those parts, but it's the parts coming together to make that collection, to make it what it is. Anyway, these are some of the debates that we engage with. Yeah, so where was I going? Dependent arising is the conventional truth, so that everything is dependent on what? We've already talked about causes and condition. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. And even if it did, that would be the causes and conditions, it falling from the sky. So everything's, we say, produced by causes and conditions, and we can analyse, you know, the table and the tree and the seed that had to be planted for the tree to grow, et cetera, and then somebody came along and chopped down the tree, and had processed the wood, and then somebody got the wood and made it into a table, et cetera. We can analyse moment by moment of the existence of the table, all the causes and conditions that came into effect for that, and including all the insects who possibly lost their lives in the cutting down, and the chainsaw and the truck, and et cetera. Okay, that's really obvious. All of us can get that, right? And then we say, and also the next part we would say, but different schools have different views on that it's dependent on its parts. So if I say table, it's dependent on what? Having the top, having legs. I've got to be careful because tables these days don't always have 4 legs, because I can't say 4 legs, but I can for this one. It's got 4 legs. Yep, just checking. So for every object, we have a description of what it is, and then it has to have a function. So we say suitable to hold the vase, to hold text, to hold mala, to hold whatever we place on it. So that makes it a table, right? We could also say that's not pervasive, because it could also be a ledge, it could all go, you know, whatever. We could debate. And that would help us hone our ideas as well. Okay. Here we go from here. So yes, I should go to the beginning. Well, the first school, so there are 2 schools that we call lower schools that present that external objects are truly existent, that they exist out there, like table, from its own side, independently. Independently of me, I had nothing to do with the making of the table, etc. So the 2 lower schools hold this view, but to one slightly more refined than the other. So the first one is the Vaibhashika, so that's also in English, Great Exposition School. So they follow particular teaching of the Buddha. Of course, they didn't just make it up. So they believe external objects are truly existent, meaning they exist independently from its own side. This is you know, person, table, tree, whatever. So that's the first school. We'll just go through them in brief and then in more detail. And then the next one, Sautrantika, is the sutra followers. So they follow, in general, 1 or 2 particular sutras of the Buddha. So they only assert the sutras taught by the Buddha effectively in that first turning of the wheel. So this is where the Theravadan school fits in. So they don't use any commentaries, and they also believe that external objects are truly existent, you know, and people, person, or self is truly. Well, no, actually, we'll delete that bit. So then the next school. So those schools follow, we would say, previously we would say follow the Hinayana. But then the next school, next two main schools, of which we look at also another sub-school, is Mahayana teachings. So we have the Chittamatrans, or mind only. So they say that everything that exists is based on mental imprints. It's like if we don't have the mental imprint for something, we can't engage with it. It doesn't exist. And so that everything is perceived, everything we perceive is due to projections of the mind. And there is this mind itself, which they, in English, we call mind basis of all, which it's sort of like this permanent consciousness that truly exists. So it's sort of like we study a lot. I mean, the Buddha taught a lot about the mind and how the mind functions, and minds, not just one mind. So they posit this one sort of almost independent consciousness that is the basis for everything that arises. Okay. And there's ways we could debate that to be true. And then we have the followers of the middle way, Madhyamika. So this is originally from Nagarjuna in the 3rd century. So they say, oh, don't go to the two extremes. So the two extremes is that things are permanent, truly existing from their own side. And the other one is nihilism. Well, if they don't exist like that, they mustn't exist. And this can be a danger when people hear the word emptiness, because they think nothingness, but it's not nothingness. We've always got to think empty of what? Empty of existing independently, permanently, empty of existing from its own side, empty of existing by way of its own characteristics. And all these different terms are used because different schools assert some level of, but there must be something existing out there independently. There has to be, otherwise you can't have anything existing, right? So these are the 4 schools, and then the Madhyamika, the middle way, that's 2 sub-schools. One is the autonomous and one is the middle way consequence, which is the one we follow. So it gets a bit, if you can see, philosophy is a bit dry. So each school asserts selflessness, right? But what do we mean by selfless? So there's different interpretations of what selfless is. So, for example, the lower 2 schools would say selflessness of person, being the sense of this permanent, unitary, independent I, that I, am hurt, or I love with, or I this, I that, and that we interrogate, and that I doesn't exist anywhere. So all schools would assert that is as long as I would say, hallucination my mind has made up, this sense of I. And we grasp at that. Because we grasp at that innate sense of I, we continue on circling in all these suffering existences in samsara. What we call samsara is a state of mind. Okay, and so each one has different presentations of about becoming Buddhist is to achieve the cessation, sort of liberation, say, from all this suffering, the different types of suffering, but at a more and more subtle level. So we have 3 main groups of the hearer. So the hearer is the one who hears the Buddhist teachings. A solitary realizer is the one that, having heard the teachings, goes away and meditates until they attain self-liberation. And then, they go on lifetimes in a cave, sort of thing. And then the Bodhisattva practitioner, the Mahayana practitioner, says, well, it's, I've got to just not have liberation for myself. What about everybody else? Look at the suffering in the world. And so assert that one can become a Buddha. And so the different schools have different ideas around that. So the lower schools say, well, that we cannot obtain that omniscience, right? And that's because it wasn't in that first turning of the wheel in those teachings, because Buddha taught according to, the disposition and what people were prepared to hear. So their goal is self-liberation, not Buddhahood. Whereas Mahayanas, the goal is Buddhahood. So when we talk about Mahayanas, in the sort of associations in terms of how it spread. So we talk about Chan Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, talk about Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and what else? Korean, Vietnam. This association with countries is where the Mahayana predominantly spread. If we talk about the Theravadan teachings, predominantly spread Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, probably a few other places I haven't mentioned. But all the traditions are alive and well in Australia, and now probably in all Western countries at least. It's a bit restricted in some of those countries in terms of what they can practice. Are we going so far? So far, so good? Yeah. So we're going to go in a little bit more detail on each of these schools this week and next week, just to get a sense of, well, if I have to have an understanding of the different schools, and we could see where we maybe wouldn't agree. And this does involve using some terms, but I'll try and not use, well, it's unavoidable to use the terms. So there's this first one, the Great Exposition, the Vaibhashika school, is they assert that external objects are truly existent, but they don't assert self-cognizer. What that means is they don't believe the mind can observe the mind. It's quite interesting, William James was the brother of Henry James, the author, even though I can't remember any of his famous books, but they were famous books. When was that? Turn of the 19th into the 20th century. So William James was very interested in investigating here. He wrote varieties of religious experience or spiritual experience, one or the other. He talks about spiritual experiences, and he talks about the need for introspection, the mind to observe the mind, but then he says, but we're not able to do it. So he would fit in that school. He would, of the belief, like he had this idea that we need to do it, but didn't think that we can. And yet we know our mind can observe our mind. We know that, right? We can observe thoughts arising, we can observe emotions, we can observe imagery, we can observe dreams, we can observe whatever arises in the mind.
He got hooked into the idea that self-observation was not scientific enough.
Well, there is that idea, it's very interesting. I don't know if anybody has encountered Alan Wallace in their Buddhist journey, but Alan Wallace believes that if we really want to study the mind, what you've got to do is study, the meditator becomes the researcher, right? They're the one who's studying the mind. And we'd say the reason we've got even all these ideas is because of that, is because of people, interrogating the truth, applying their own analysis of their own mind to be able to come to some understanding of truth. Okay. So, these ones, those who follow the Theravadan tenets, let's say these days, aim for self-liberation or nirvana. So it's not that in a Mahayana that we say that doesn't exist, but we say we're not going to stop there as a Mahayanist. It's sort of like, well, that's all very well for me, but what about everyone else? However, the Buddha also taught that those who follow that path and achieve self-liberation, what is self-liberation? When you're free of all the, what we say, afflictive obscuration, all the toxic emotions, all the negative thoughts, and you're able to directly perceive this emptiness of inherent existence, not just intellectually rationalize it and apply the reasoning and logic, but you're able to experience that directly. So then you're free of all those disturbing states of mind, which are the cause for every other suffering that we encounter, right? So you're free of that. It doesn't mean that you don't still get aches and pains and so forth, but the suffering, what do they say? Pain is pain, suffering is optional, something like that. Yeah. So anyway, so that's the difference. However, as the Buddha said, that someone achieving self-liberation, where it says it, the experience, we call it nirvana. From a Mahayana perspective, we call that lower nirvana, because we say the actual liberation or final liberation is omniscience of a Buddha. But a Theravadan wouldn't say that's lower nirvana. So nirvana being a state of bliss that arises with that direct perceptual realization of emptiness is an experience, a bliss, and everything's unobstructed. You have no, anything holding you back because your mind's not cluttered with all this rubbish, basically. But keeping in mind that all our positive qualities are innate, so they develop more and more. So, of course, Theravadan practitioners would develop not only that wisdom, but develop compassion, loving kindness, and so forth. I mean, just look at the Metta Sutra and things like that. So, because they are innate to us. Okay. So they assert that all external objects are truly existent, inherently existent from their own side, self-existent, independent, all these terms, whereas the middle way consequence school, which we follow, would say that all objects, including our own mind, lack inherent existence. So they're not truly existent. They all arise in dependence on causes and conditions. And anything that arises in dependence on causes and conditions can't exist independently. It's a contradiction, right? Okay. Okay. So let me see what else. I'm trying not to cover everything because it involves a lot of terminology. So how they assert something exists is that, as I mentioned before, that's something able to perform a function. So the vase functions to hold the flowers. This thing functions as this thing functions as a microphone that is the basis for that functioning. So we look at that. And so human beings, we're also phenomena, things, because we perform a function. We walk, we talk, we eat, we study, we try and understand the Buddhist teachings and so forth. And then everything that exists is divided into permanent things and impermanent things. So we talk about permanent things being things like uncompounded space. So not a particular space, but uncompounded space. So a particular space, I might say, is the space in my stomach, right? The space in my stomach, but then I eat and there's no space. overweight, got a big belly. So that's not non-compounded space. It's a space that's created, we could say, through the absence of food in that instance. So we've got spaces throughout our body. So the non-compounded space is this permanent phenomena. And then they also assert the cessations or analytical cessations. This comes in the Four Noble Truths. The first truth, the suffering of suffering, then true suffering. There is suffering. So we identify the suffering, the different forms of suffering and the different categories. And then the origins of that suffering, which is karma and delusions. And then, but we can be free of that, which is that liberation, which is called analytical cessation, that we get there by analysing the Four Noble Truths. And also non-analytical cessations that arise during meditation. You know, when meditation, where your mind's completely in the zone, that it's not being disturbed, that all the clutter's been eliminated from your mind. Okay. So there's specific, very few permanent things. So then impermanent things is most things we engage with, things that are everything that comes into existence, created objects, and impermanence itself. Okay. Also, all schools divide into conventional truth and ultimate truth. So I mentioned that, under conventional truth, we think about dependent arising, that everything arises in dependence on causes, conditions, at least at that level. There's different levels of dependent arising. Basically, everything we engage with. And then the ultimate truth, we'd say, is the true nature of that thing. So the definition that's used is that a conventional truth, this is Great Exposition School, so that a phenomenon, or we could say object, such as cup, that if it were broken or mentally separated into parts, the mind apprehending it would cease. So say, I've got this cup, so being in the nature of a conventional truth, let's say mug, it's got a round container with a flat bottom and a handle suitable to hold the water, or liquid, we could say. So, and the mind apprehends that it can perform that function. But if I smash the cup or drop it and it breaks, or the cup ceases to exist. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? But if we apply that to ourselves, we also analyse how do I exist? How does this I actually exist as something, we perceive as something truly existent, something to be protected, to be nourished and comforted and so forth. And yet, we find it, we obsess over this, don't we, of this me, this I. So we do an analysis. Is this I, if this really exists, this I, not this body, but this I, if that exists truly as I perceive it to, does it exist in the body or part of the body? Because I keep pointing here. So is that where the I exists? I mean, if you did a surgery and open up, you couldn't find an I in there somewhere. Or is it in my head because I say I think? Or is it in the whole, my body? Or is it external because if it's my body, maybe that I'm this possessor out there that possesses this body. So these are the different ways that we analyze. But what happens when we die? The body ceases. So why take so much effort to take care of the body? Of course, we've got to take care of the body, but put so much attention on it as we do. And we say, well, then if it's not the body, maybe it's the mind. I think, I this, I that. And so then we analyze which moment of mind and so forth is it. So we do this analysis to see, does this I truly exist anywhere? And so that's pretty common between all the schools that would come in one way to posit the same thing. Now, they also believe in what are called partless particles. And they're not alone in that, because that collider thing, no, COLLIDER, not kaleidoscope, that collider, Higgs boson, wasn't it? They're looking for the God particle. There must be a particle from which everything comes, or I'm not quite sure what the thing. So this is very similar to this school that asserts it's the most subtle level of an object. There's got to be something there that's subtle, which can't be broken down, and it can't be defined. And so it's saying, if there's this subtle particle, then that can't be broken down. We said that anything that can be broken down, the mind perceiving it ceases, right? So it doesn't mean our mind in general ceases, because we have different minds. This is the thing. So if I've got this partless particle, then that mind's apprehension of it doesn't cease. So they don't use the term emptiness, they say selflessness. And anyway, so they're saying there's got to be something that can't be broken down any further. And so this is where the subsequent schools all come in and debate and going, well, your partless particle still has parts. If it can't be divided down any further, what parts does it still have?
It's like the top and the bottom.
Top and the bottom and the sides, depending on what shape it is. It's got direction. So they assert, no, it doesn't have direction, doesn't have those parts. So nonetheless, it's a very refined view. I mean, if you think the Buddha talked about atoms, or as Leslie said yesterday, they would have been called something else. And I think this is what they would have been called, particles, these particles that make everything up, long before Rutherford, right? So they're still pretty advanced in their thinking, of thinking this. And given that, how much money did we spend? Did they find that God particle, by the way? No, they didn't find it, because it's not to be found. That's why. That's why. And then, of course, we have, in terms of consciousness, and old schools would assert this, that we have, that we have moments of consciousness, so that each moment of mind comes from a previous moment of mind, and so forth. And we analyze back and say, mind is beginningless. Why? Because mind can only come from a previous moment of mind. And so you keep tracking back, and it blows your mind, because surely there's got to be a beginning and end to everything. No, apparently not. So, but what they say is there are temporary, partless moments of consciousness, temporary ones, that you can't separate one moment of consciousness from another, is what they assert. And so they assert that this and the partless particles are ultimate truth, right? They assert that as ultimate truth. Okay. So in terms of person, they say person or self. Some say that it's the collection of all the five aggregates is the self. It's form, feeling, discrimination, composition of factors, consciousness, as an illustration of the self. And others within the same school assert it's consciousness itself as the illustration of the person. So not quite sure what happens when you die, cease to exist. It's a bit dangerous. Okay. So the idea or concept of a person, of self, it's impermanent, it has parts, and is dependent. So, yeah, okay. We don't need to go into the details of that. Okay. Alrighty. Any questions so far? Comments, observations, debates? Okay. So one other aspect here that we're going to talk about is that in the Mahayana schools, there are two types of obscuration. So here they're following this self-liberation. So the obscurations to nirvana are those afflicted states of mind, deluded states of mind. And in the Mahayana, we also talk about obscurations to omniscience, so that it's said that those afflictive obscurations you've purified, you've got rid of, so you can have a direct perceptual realization of reality. But we still have these imprints on our mental continuum that obscure our mind. And so we have to continue then on the bodhisattva paths and grounds, and the practice is to purify those, and then also tantra. If we don't, because what the tantric practices do is bring the resultant body of the Buddha into the path. So, however, the goal of the hearer and solitude realizer is to attain that nirvana, freedom from psychic existence, from samsara, from suffering existence. So in general, when we look at in the Lam Rim, the three scopes, the lower scope is that your goal is to have a higher rebirth in your next life. So either human or in God realms, to be able to continue on the path. So the main practice is one of ethics, ethical conduct, taking vows, taking refuge. In the middle scope, what your aim is for this self-liberation. So that is in relation to the Four Noble Truths, understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And then the Mahayana path, the great scope, is your goal is Buddhahood, as we've mentioned. So why is it that lower schools such as this don't accept the Mahayana Sutra teachings? Is because after the Buddha passed away, or this seems to be how it came about, those Mahayana practitioners, and particularly Tantra Vajrayana, because the Buddha taught Tantra Vajrayana in secret to those whose minds were ripe for it. So there weren't public teachings. So they went into solitude to practice. And so they became less and less visible. They weren't out there teaching. They were more like wanting to gain the realizations themselves. And so the Hinayana schools, and now mainly the Theravada, became, the norm of the teachings that spread. And so that accounts for that difference. Yeah.
Those Bodhisattva and tantric practitioners, did they not come to those enclaves where they were reciting all the teachings of the Buddha, and so then that were included there? Do you know, did I explain that well? You know how many years after the Buddha died, they all came together and they recited the Buddha's Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, yeah.
And so were these other teachings not included there, and that's why?
Well, it may well be the case that they weren't included there. Yeah.
Because that's always troubled me, and it just occurred to me while we were teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. So of having the realizations. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we have these three levels of practitioner. So the hearer lineage, the one who gets the teachings directly. So it's said that they practice for 3 lifetimes or more, and they attain the small enlightenment or nirvana of a hearer, Arya. Sort of like, oh, why don't we do that one? It's only 3, only 3 lifetimes or more, right? The solitary realizer lineage, so they're of the middle capable being. So they practice for 100 eons or more continually and attain a middling nirvana, enlightenment of the solitary realizer. So you could see it's quite significant. To attain that is not an easy thing. And those following the bodhisattva path practice for at least 3 countless great eons. And this is what the Buddha showed. So we have different presentations according to the Buddha's, according to the school, about that life of Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha, who we know then as Shakyamuni Buddha. For a Mahayanist, we would say that being that became known as Shakyamuni Buddha had already attained enlightenment and was displaying how to attain that in that lifetime as a teaching. The lower schools would say that no, that person, Siddhartha Gautama, by that lifetime actually became a Buddha in that lifetime, right? So that then relates to the sorts of practices and so forth that come along. So in the Mahayana schools, we can say that emphasis, because it's bodhicitta, on the purest altruistic mind with great compassion. So great compassion, being compassionate for all sentient beings without exception, is a very powerful mind. And to enter the Mahayana path, it says that you generate uncontrived or spontaneous bodhicitta. That means 24/7 your mind's in bodhicitta. That's just wanting to benefit others. So you can see that's a very tall order. Well, it is to my mind a very tall order. And on the other hand, if your goal is self-liberation, it's also a very tall order, because to enter that path of self-liberation, you have to have an uncontrived renunciation of samsara, an uncontrived meaning a wish to definitely emerge, and that's with you 24/7, that you're not caught up in worldly affairs at all. You're not attached to worldly affairs at all, not for 1 second. No craving for this or that or whatever. No wanting to be praised, no hating to be blamed. It sounds really great. But you can see how already that's also a very tall order. Right. It doesn't mean that those, that Theravadan practitioners, for example, we say, don't have compassion. They do have compassion, but not that motivation to become a Buddha in order to really know how to benefit others. So they don't have that altruistic bodhicitta. They do acknowledge and assert a bodhisattva path, but they don't themselves cultivate bodhicitta. So that's the difference. We cannot say that they don't. I mean, a friend of mine who stayed at a Theravada nunnery, and she said, they're full of compassion. Well, of course they are. I mean, Charles Darwin said we can't help it. We can't help but help. We're hardwired for compassion. So you don't have to follow any faith whatsoever to have that innate compassion. We all have it. We see it, we see the crisis compassion that happens when something like Gaza or Ukraine, these situations, floods and droughts, terrible floods in Spain. I mean, as soon as I saw that, I was, your heart sort of weeps, doesn't it? So, of course, we have that. Everyone has that. Okay. I won't go into the different parts, but that's a whole other teaching. I don't. Let me see. Okay. So in relation to the two types of obscurations, that the delusions that we say, or the afflicted states of mind that are obstacles. This school, the Great Exposition School, says it's not necessary to have an antidote to what we call knowledge obscurations or obscurations to omniscience, because when you die, there's no longer a base for imprints. So they say that the mind, at the time of that nirvana, that mind ceases. So that contaminated form also ceases. So there's none of those imprints. Right.
You mean it's part of the death process, though?
When you attain that, then when you die, when you attain that nirvana without remainder, it means without the obscurations. So you become an Arya being, so that mind ceases, is what they say. So the different schools assert it in very different ways. Yeah. We wouldn't say that the mind ceases. It's just like, what, you pop into another mind? What happens? Yeah. All right. So the next lower school, or next one above, is the Sutra followers, the Sautantrika, which means followers of Sutra, which is a really, really interesting school because it explores all the different types of mind. So it's one of the richest teachings on the theory of the mind and the functioning of the mind. So, this way we learn a lot from that school about presentation of valid mind, valid cognition, what's an invalid mind, wrong perception and so forth, which we also won't be going into. So they accept both self-cognizers and external objects existing out there independently. So you can see this is a progression that the Vaibhashika, the great exposition school, doesn't accept self-cognizer, that ability of the mind to conceive the mind or observe the mind. Not only that they, expounded a very elaborate theory of the mind as the Buddha taught, sort of like whatever needs to be known about the mind, the Buddha taught, or whatever can be. This is why these days the Dalai Lama having those dialogues with the Mind and Life Institute, with the mind scientists, because science of the mind is a very, very young science. It's like about 50 years, whereas like I think archaeology was archaeology the first or something. So the schools they're very well established. The other side of the material sciences are very well established, but the mind science is very, very new. So they follow the sutras in that they follow the direct words of the Buddha, not the entire sutras but specific teachings. And they also accept the teachings explained by the Buddha via examples. So for example, the Buddha taught impermanence by talking about an object being broken down into its parts and getting down to moment by moment. So this is the subtle impermanence that we don't see. Let's say this is established cup, but what we don't see is the moment by moment going out of existence of the cup. However, I can see where it's faded, the paint here, in here, so I can observe some, because it's a more manifest level of impermanence that I can observe, but I can't observe even though intellectually I know this is going out of existence, I can't notice that at all. I notice it more with myself, but I think that's also the manifest part. It's definitely perishing aggregates. Yeah. Okay, so there are those who follow the Abhidhamma Kosha, so the treasury of knowledge, which was Vasubandhu, and those who follow reasoning and logic. And so that is presented by Dharmakirti. So these are ones who were great scholars at Nalanda. Nalanda University in Bihar was the first established university in the world. You can't say continuous because it's all rubble these days. But we talk about, in particular, the 17 great scholars or Pandits, scholars of Nalanda, and they were among that crowd. So this text by Dharmakirti was on valid cognition, in other words, valid mind, valid perception. And that gets broken down into a lot of different parts. And so it's the most profound material on the mind and cognition or awareness. So we have a topic also in the basic program that is called awareness and knowers, which is what Dharmakirti was writing on. And, our sort of Geshis that come to our centres and all the other monastics in those monasteries spend over 20 years studying that text. So they don't go, oh, that's a lower school, we don't need to know. We do need to know, because it's, as it says, it's got the most elaborate understanding of the theories of the mind as the Buddha taught. And then, that they study this and, of course, other major texts, and have great debates between the monasteries on these topics to refine their own understanding on that. So every year there's, in Bulgaria, there's I was going to say debating competition. Well, it sort of feels like that. I wasn't at Chenrezig Institute recently when the Geshis were debating. There were 28, I think, Geshis there, and they did a debate. I didn't get to notice that, but I was at one in Adelaide where maybe we had 7 Geshis, and I used to say debating was a non-contact sport because they have, they present, they posit say tomatoes are red, and then and then somebody's going to come back, what about purple tomatoes, what about this, what about this, what about this, what about this, and there's sort of, but it's with physical action. Now, I used to say it was a non-contact sport until I observed in Adelaide, Geshe Zopa, he was supposed to be, I don't know, MC or something, but he came over and pushed Geshe Zopa out of the way and took over. Well, there you go. It's very physical, right? Of course, all friendly. They were staying in one house. They were all debating in the house. They were debating over dinner. They were debating in the car on the way to the centre. So that's why they decided to show it, because they don't get to, sort of do that sharpening of the mind in that way by bouncing off each other very often, because they don't come together very often. There's a one Geshe here and one over there and one over there, and none here, etc. So anyway, this is how you refine it. And they start doing that at a very early age, not just the monks, the nuns as well, because we have the Geshe-mas as well. Yeah. So this school, so Tantrika means they follow the sutras of the Buddha, and they're also called exemplifiers because they like to explain all phenomena by way of examples, right? Which is what they liked about the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha giving examples. So they have a very different idea about ultimate reality, ultimate truth. Are things that are truly existent things, that they are products, which we would say would be a conventional truth because it's impermanent, something impermanent. So they posit that differently. So they talk about these products, something being able to perform a function ultimately or truly. So they have a different way of establishing true existence. So, for example, the reality of existence of the table, it can be used to support things. As I said, it can be moved, it can be smashed to bits. So that's the impermanent. And permanent phenomena, like non-compounded space, we can't move space from here to there and so forth. So that is non-compounded space is untouchable, unfillable, free from construction, and is permanent. So, and then they say that a conventional truth is a phenomenon that is not able to perform a function ultimately. So those things like non-compounded space and so forth. So it sort of feels like it's the switching the other way around. And what would we, synonymous with their definition of conventional truth, is something that is falsely existent. So we would all agree that, what do they mean, falsely existent? Of course, everything that we're seeing here, including ourselves, exists, but how we perceive it to exist is false. That we perceive it as something out there, independent of me, nothing to do with, as we would say in the middle way, consequence school, the most subtle level of dependent arising is that it's merely imputed by mind, that I have my own elaborate story of everything and everyone I see, and that's imputed by my mind, so that nothing exists independently of that imputation. So one example here of it, let's just say, of an imputation. When I lived at Vajrayana Institute in Sydney, we went to a Nepali restaurant. We took Geshe Samten to a Nepali restaurant, and he ordered roti, right? He grew up in India. Roti's his go-to bread. And they brought out this bread. And he said, I ordered roti. And they said, this is roti. He said, no, it's not. Sir, we call this roti. Very good answer, he said, because it's merely labelled. They impute the name on that thing, roti. He imputes something else, but they impute roti. So it is on the imputation of the mind. So he was happy to eat it then because they won the debate. So you never know. It's possible to win a debate with a Geshe. Yeah. So a false existence is that its ultimate existence is that, we perceive something as being, let's say, usually permanent, independent, self-sufficient, substantial, all these things that it's not, and the different schools assert that partless particle. And it doesn't exist like that. Yes, it's dependent on causes condition. Yes, it's dependent on its past. But from a middle way consequence school, ultimately, it's merely labelled by the mind as that. So we could take one object and see, I always think, an ant would call this, I don't know, a cliff, very big cliff to climb. Maybe they'd give up. It's not a cliff because it's soft. Anyway, they'd call it something else. And so we see this with, we take the example of water. And so we humans, thank you very much. Delicious water. A predator being, a hungry ghost being, experiences it if they ever get to actually have some, because usually they get there and the water's dried up, but it's like pus. The experience is pus. A being in the God realm, it's nectar. So dependent on where you're positioned in this whole samsara, you're going to experience it differently. Like the Dalai Lama, when he was on MasterChef, I don't know if anyone saw when the Dalai, yes, Christine saw, quite some time ago now. So he was in Melbourne, and he was giving a teaching in the morning, and then he said, I'm off to MasterChef for lunch, and everybody laughed, but he was off to MasterChef for lunch. Oh, well, they had come there, they set up a studio, and so all the young people cooking, and one of them was really upset because her dish didn't turn out nicely, and she was crying and so forth, and Dalai Lama took her hand and said it's all right and pacified her, and she was probably blissed out by then because, having the Dalai Lama pat your hand and so forth. And then he was just totally focused on her. So my deduction was, if you're on MasterChef and the Dalai Lama's there, cry. Be upset. He's going to pacify you, yes. Anyway, so then he had to judge. And he goes, I'm a Buddhist monk. Everything, I enjoy everything, everything's equally enjoyable, right? So he didn't make any, this one's better than that one or anything like that. Everything's equally enjoyable. And he's probably right. Everything to him is blissful, is enjoyable, So, yeah. So like that. Okay. Okay, dog. That's like that. Alrighty. We did that. It goes into a great lot of detail. This is Geshe Zopa's book on penance. I'm trying to follow. So just to talk briefly on, I mentioned about entering either, should we say, Theravada path or Mahayana path. When we talk about it, there's basically 5 different paths. So this is, the first one is the path of accumulation. This is where we talk about the first thing to engage with is accumulation of eons of merit. And how do we do that? We do that through our making offerings, engaging in virtue, our meditation practices, reciting mantras, basically, everything that we can do to create more and more virtuous states of mind to accumulate. We've got to accumulate a lot of merit to even have any of these realizations or perceptions, or even to get the conditions. We say, those Mahayana practitioners who at the time of the Buddha went off into retreat, they had the conditions for that. They didn't have to go home and cook for the family or whatever, or work on even though the Buddha accepted, he was quite radical at his time. I mentioned that only the Brahmin caste could engage in philosophical learning and get the teachings and so forth from other traditions. So he cut across all of that, all passes, male, female, but all the castes down to the Dalits, the untouchables, the lepers, everybody, welcome. So it was quite radical for the time. Nonetheless, you have to have the conditions arise through your accumulation of merit to be able to, okay, say I get to go on retreat. Do I get to stay there? Does something happen? Like at Daytong Ling and Kangaroo Island a few years ago, and there's a monk friend who's now on retreat there again. Anyway, he's got a few months to go. And so he went there specifically to do this retreat. And it was when the fires happened, the big bushfires happened. So he had to leave. And he tried again and he had to leave. And then now a few years later, accumulating the conditions again to go back and be able to do that. So we need a lot of merit accumulated. So when I mentioned that, this first path of accumulation is either the Theravadan path by generating this definite wish to be free from samsara, that is, 24/7, or as a Mahayanist, genuine, spontaneous bodhicitta. And at that time, a bodhisattva can emanate 100 bodies, right? Different bodies, go to a different Buddha, Pure Lands, receive teachings from the Buddha, very efficient. You have 100 teachings at once. The Buddha taught different teachings at once. So at the time when the Buddha was teaching that second turning of the wheel, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, at the same time, the Buddha was at Amravati giving the Kala Chakra initiation at the same time. No problem for a Buddha, because you can emanate as many bodies, go to all the different realms and everything. Anyway, so if you can do that, then it's much easier to accumulate much more merit because you've got more bodies to be able to accumulate the merit with. Meanwhile, back on earth, as I like to feel, back with our ordinary beings. Yeah. So then the next path after that, so that has different stages. Each path has different stages. A path of preparation has 4 different levels. And the last moment of that path of preparation is when you enter what's called the path of seeing. So path of seeing is when you have that, you see emptiness, you see reality directly as it is. Sorry, Geshe Zopa said some people have said they'd achieved the path of seeing, and he says, have you completed the path of accumulation? They said, what's that? So that's a no then. I mean, it can be possible, I think, that we can have a momentary glimpse into that. But for that to be stable and actually pervasive in every moment is another thing. Because, first, when you realize emptiness, it's got to be conceptually. It's through logic and reasoning. And only much later does it come. Even the logic and reasoning can be difficult, but only much later can come as a direct perception. Yeah. And so then once that path of seeing is quite short in a way, because you actualize the realization of emptiness. And that leads to the path of meditation, where you're going over reinforcing that again and again, different levels of realization of emptiness, going more deeply into that. Yeah. So it's quite a long process. So you're going from the gross to the more subtle of those knowledge obscurations that we talk about. And then once you've completed that path, then you come to the path of no more learning. Basically, you're a Buddhahood. So the first 4 paths are what we call the learner paths. So they're the ones that we focus on. But those paths are presented differently, obviously, for a Theravadan, or actually for a hearer, a solitary realizer, and Mahayana Bodhisattva path. And so, yeah, they're presented. So effectively we have 3 sets of that, which I say, oh, there's 15 paths. There's not 15 paths. It's just how it's presented is different according to which level you're engaging in that. So then the Sautantrika Sutra school assert the selflessness of the person as the emptiness or absence of a permanent, partless, and independent person. The absence of a permanent, partless, and independent person. So they don't assert that there's some, little particle there. And then the subtle selflessness is the absence of a substantially self-existent person. What does that mean? Without relying on the aggregates, the person just, ta-da, spontaneously arises. Well, we know that doesn't happen. Okay. But like the Vibhashika, they also don't assert selflessness of phenomena. So that comes along with the Mahayana schools. So they're very much focused on an understanding of selflessness of person, but not of phenomena. And phenomena includes the aggregates of the body and every other object that exists. All right. So that's the lower schools. Any questions, comments?
I need to draw a diagram, like a
really,
really big piece of paper.
Yeah. There are diagrams. I was looking for one that laid out the 4 schools together that I know it's in my mind, but I couldn't quite find it. But I have got on the 5 paths, so I'll bring that next week. Yeah.
Excuse me, Venerable.
Yeah.
Did these different schools evolve at different times? Did one evolve?
Well, they did, but they did evolve at one time. For example, at different times. The idea is that each one evolved in relation to the previous school, like refine the view from that and refine that view and refine that view. But you do find sometimes that actually, like you have Nagarjuna establishing the middle way view, which is, you'd say, the highest view, in the 3rd century, right? So why didn't that become the dominant view at the time? So it's quite interesting because like this, the next school, the mind only, that was 800 years after the Buddha. So, yeah. So in a sense, yes, it is fairly chronological. Because particularly when you get towards, and that's rather late in the piece, Lama Tsongkhapa, taking all of those schools and all of their views and analysing them to see were there any gaps in their understanding and saying, oh, but what about this and what about that? So he takes all of the different views extensively like that. Yeah. So...
Hello, Venerable. I have a question.
Yeah.
So in previous teachings, so it's sort of been described that like the Theravada, like reaching nirvana, like will get tapped on the shoulder by the Buddha, and their path's not finished.
Yeah. Yes.
Did they accept that at the moment, or are they aware of that?
I don't know whether they would probably not accept that because they would say that's coming from Mahayana sutras and they debate whether the Mahayana sutras are valid.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Those teachings, so they debate that they're valid.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That buys that up nicely. Yeah.
But it is true that, I mean, the Buddhist job is a Buddhist job. I mean, there are many, Buddhas on every atom of space. If only we could see them. Or might be too much to see them all. But the job of a Buddha is to work for the welfare of all sentient beings until all sentient beings are free of samsara, right? So that's regardless of what philosophical view you have. The Buddha taught 84,000 paths. So that's a lot of paths to enlightenment, and we can't even name, if you name the recognized or major or even not major, but all the forms of faith or spirituality and so forth, we couldn't be able to name all those that are in the world today. We wouldn't get to 84,000. But yeah, so those following a Theravada path will abide in that bliss of nirvana until such point as, well, yeah, I mean, the analogy is a Buddha taps them on the shoulder and say, enough bliss and emptiness already, get up the path, there's beings to save. But it doesn't necessarily happen quite like that, there is a, I'm just trying to think, I haven't got the teaching in my mind about how that actually manifests that. Anyway, yes, they do then subsequently enter the Mahayana path, right? Subsequently enter the Mahayana path. And then, you know, that trajectory to it is true. Because you've got to think, you know, the Buddha, if the Buddha's working for the welfare of all sentient beings, that's regardless if they follow a faith or not. And, you know, having just been, like I mentioned, that conference, but I seem to be around a lot of Christians, yes, because it was all God this and God that. And I'm like, yeah, well, they didn't find the God particle, so where's God? No, I wouldn't dare say that to them because I know what they mean. And I also sometimes remind them that we don't follow God. And actually, I was having an exchange with a Muslim friend at this conference. And it was very interesting because, you know, she was saying, so you don't believe in God, so how do you believe it is? And we're both talking about mind. And he said, that's what we believe. So it was quite interesting that you find the language where you both say, yeah, we believe the same thing at that level. And even amongst Christians, like excuse me, one Christian nun who I like to read, Meg Funk, Sister Margaret Funk, and she has a series of books, and one of them was on the desert fathers and desert mothers, and without using the word emptiness, they were talking about emptiness, and I sort of thought, oh, so that's what they were doing out there in the desert. I mean, we say go to the mountain, they say go to the desert, you know. So it's quite interesting to actually investigate. Because to realize emptiness, you don't have to be Buddhist. You don't have to, you know, it can help get, for us, very helpful to get the teachings and be guided along that way, but you don't have to be Buddhist. Because if it's a truth, it's a truth, regardless, right? Yeah.
It's the main distinction between the two is that one believes in the Creator God.
Creator God. We say we have created.
So
yeah, it's not God.
A phenomena or a particle that
yes.
that goes to your bone.
Yeah.
So that is the difference. But
I think they still believe in mum and dad coming together and you're born. I think they still believe in that.
They don't believe in karma.
No. Well, they don't.
But they do meditation.
They do meditation. I mean, I've gone to the World Christian Meditation Movement. Father Lawrence Freeman, who revived that, and he said the reason he became a monk is to meditate. And I don't seem to keep this on. Him and the Dalai Lama are, you know, good friends. So they probably, you know, who knows what conversations they have there at another level. But, you know, that reviving, actually, anyone who's reviving meditation movements in this world at the moment, or any time, but critically now, is a very powerful thing because, as the Dalai Lama said, peace in the world arises from peace in our own mind, which you get through particularly calm abiding, shamatha meditation, by engaging in that. And then he said, if every school child learnt to meditate at a young age in one generation, we'd have world peace. I mean, look at the world. It doesn't seem possible, does it? It is possible. It's that simple. It's that simple. But there has to be a lot of agreement for that to happen, and not to think, oh, meditation is a Buddhist thing or a Christian thing or this thing or that thing. Anyone who has a functioning mind can meditate. Even challenged by mental health issues. I used to work with the guys in the forensic hospital at Morisset near Newcastle. You know, of course, there were days that said, oh, today's not a good day. I can't meditate today. Just do the mantras and that would soothe his mind. But there was a way in. Mantras are another form of meditation. So there were ways in. Of course, the guy in the next room who was in a padded cell, throwing himself around, didn't have that capacity right at that time. But, we can. And actually, it's what's needed in the world. We have so many people who are just totally following those, because we're not taught at an early age how to deal with afflicted states of mind. We're told, sit down and be quiet or whatever, but we're not taught how to deal with those states of mind when they arise. And this is what the Buddha taught, showed us how to do that. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so then we enter the Mahayana schools. And so this one, mind-only school, or Chitta Matra, same thing. Chitta is mind. Chitta is also heart, mind, same thing. So let me just look here. So if we think about that second turning of the wheel on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, so this was mainly based on the basis of that middle way consequence school which we follow. I was going to say based on, because it wasn't established yet, what was the basis for those teachings. And so these Chittamatrans, mind only, so they don't assert external objects. Of course, vase, table, everything exists. But they say that it relies on mental imprints, that we have to have those mental imprints for those objects to arise. They do also assert self-cognizers, that awareness is able to cognize itself. And they assert that to be truly existent, this mind basis of all. So they assert, by their mind only, that all phenomena only exist in the nature of consciousness, and that whatever exists, whatever occurs, is a ripening of past mental imprints. We could say that we would agree with that in terms of karma and karmic imprints and that ripening. So, in past lives, we've accumulated many different types of imprints in our mental continuum in many different ways. And once a mental imprint is activated, this is according to Mind Only School, we see that object in relation to that imprint. Now, it might sound a bit weird, but I remember hearing when Columbus, wasn't it? Columbus, the explorer, so-called discoverer of America. So when he went down, what was it, the Cape of Good Hope or the Cape Horn, whichever one was Africa, I forget which one's which. But anyway, he went down there, and the ships were in the ocean, and they went ashore, and the people asked, well, where did you come from? And he pointed out to the ship. those people couldn't see ship. So these would say they didn't have that imprint of ship in their mind. They hadn't seen a ship before. And then they took some people out onto the ship, and after that they could see ship. Now, whether it was a linguistic, because surely they saw something, but they didn't see ship. I mean, it wasn't that they were blind and couldn't see there was something out there. It was interesting. This would agree with the mind only.
But that they couldn't know it because they didn't have a word for it?
Well, I don't know, you know, that's as much as I heard. Well, you know, you would debate that and going, but hang on a minute, they must have seen something there. They don't have that experience. It's like when the British came to Australia and Aboriginal people thought they were ghosts because they're white, you know, because they hadn't experienced white people before. Right? And so they also explain why that these imprints are why somebody will see an object as beautiful and someone else will see that same object as ugly, because it depends on the imprints are on their mental continuum, you know. And we know that if we project that something's good, then we perceive it as good. If we project that something's bad, then we perceive it as bad. So we, you know, it can make sense. Yeah. So the distinction between, because we would say in the middle way consequence school, merely labelled by mind. So what's the difference here? What's the distinction here? So the mind only school, Chitta Martins, they would say those mental imprints truly exist. Whereas in the middle way consequence, of course, we agree that things are mental projections, but does not assert that a mental projection is truly existent. So we do say, okay, I see vase. I've got the mental imprints to perceive vase, let's say. Maybe I'll say they're not so past because I've been talking about it not so long ago, so it's pretty fresh. So vase. So I have that. And once I have that in my mind, I do have a permanent image, mental image vase. Like right now, I'm not looking at the vase, but I've got a mental image of that. And we say that that mental image itself is permanent. Right.
Like a generic image.
A generic
like,
image or
like that baby shape of a car.
Yeah.
We understand
yeah.
car.
Yeah. That's how, and we use those images because people understand, you know, that for something to be, you know, we say a valid cognition, that it's accepted by conventional reality, by a conventional mind, let's say, that we all accept that's baby, that's car, that's vase, whatever.
Isn't it just a label?
It is just a label. See, that's coming from a middle way consequence school perspective. They say it's this permanent, like, mental imprint. We say, no, there's no such thing. It's a mere label that we place on it, we would say. But once I've placed that label, I do get this mental image. And it said that mental image is permanent. So I can have, say, you know, you have a mental image of a relative and then you haven't seen them for a long time. And you have to update your mental image because they don't look like that anymore. And guess what? You don't either. You know, when you look at someone and go, oh, they're looking really old. And then you've got to think, I'm looking really old too.
We label the vase.
We label it vase.
Isn't it just that?
It's just a label, yeah. But it's not.
The vase is just whatever.
Whatever. It is an object of a certain form, yeah, suitable. It's got to have a function to hold flowers. So therefore we label it vase. So this is something, yeah, it's a mere, we could say, but it's a conventional truth because otherwise how do we talk about vase? That thing. What was that?
To some extent, it depends on the language and the culture. I'll give you an example.
Please do.
I went to my great-great-grandmother's old house. and I saw on the bed what looked like a brick. And I said to my grandmother, "What's the brick doing there?" And
Yeah.
she said, "There's a pillow."
A hard pillow that you labelled brick and she labelled pillow.
She said, "That's a pillow."
Yeah.
But it was a brick. It was a brick.
It was an actual brick
It's an actual
that functioned for her as pillow. So therefore, it was. Oh, she was tough. It's like when I used to go to the Philippines and they'd say, "There's your bed," and it was like this, plank of wood. And I'd go, "Is there a bit of like that? Have a bit of plastic lay down," and that was your softness, you know, like those candy bags we have.
It was comfortable.
She slept on it and she wore down a hole in the brick. There you go.
Venerable.
Yes.
So at the time of Shakyamuni Buddha,
Yeah.
so there was teaching on conventional truth.
Yeah.
But if you trace right back, there at some point in time there wouldn't be conventional truth because there'd be no language. So it's all a build-up. So
yeah, I mean, it would say it was conventional truth is a truth that is accepted conventionally in the world. So in the world, I accept that this is vase. I don't debate is it vase or not. So it's used in the Buddha's teachings to distinguish from ultimate truth. So it was like we could say every day, but along with the conventional truth of vase is the ultimate truth of the emptiness of vase, right? And this the Buddha taught, which means that it doesn't exist out there independently, inherently, not even one particle, one atom, one subatomic particle of it exists independently, we'd say from the mind perceiving it.
As like if you think about the existence, like the timeline, like conventional truth has increased as the ultimate truth has decreased, sort of thing. Because we just
no. So it doesn't work like that. So everything that exists has a conventional truth and an ultimate truth. This ultimate truth is the same for everything. Is its emptiness, inherent existence, or true existence. The fact that it's independent arising is its conventional truth. So everything that arises in dependence on causes and conditions on its parts and being merely labelled, merely named, given a label, accepted by valid convention, accepted by worldly convention, which is the world, that's the conventional truth of it.
But if we still couldn't speak, communicate with each other, there'd be no conventional truth. Like it's just
well, the fact we can speak with each other is a conventional truth.
Yeah.
But if I couldn't communicate with you, that might be a conventional truth too, because maybe the internet went down.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Maybe my phone cut out or something. That would still be conventional. Yeah. Conventional truth has always existed. It didn't start at some point. It was just the label of conventional truth is given distinguished from ultimate truth.
Yeah.
Which itself we could say is a mere convention as well, because we accept that label of ultimate truth to mean empty inherent existence. So we accept that conventionally. Ultimate. Whoa!
Thank you.
I think food for thought, so we can leave it there for today, unless there's any final comments, discussion points, etc. Yes, Ollie.
Reminder.
A reminder.
No. If a tree falls in the wood and
oh yes, if a tree falls in the wood and no one there did it, does it make a sound? Yeah, that's a question. So you can think about that. That's something to think about. Yes. The what?
red tomato.
Oh, same as a red tomato. Yeah.
Is it red in the dark?
Yeah. I think I used red tomato because when my father was studying philosophy at university, which he went to as a mature age student, I think that was about, is a tomato red? I think that was the question.
Oh.
Okay. Also, I did want to make an announcement. Tomorrow afternoon, we're having a refuge ceremony. So for people wishing to become Buddhists or renew their vows, having taken refuge previously. So it's at 2:00 tomorrow. And of course, we have Discovering Buddhism in the morning, which is sort of continuation on Wisdom of Emptiness. I think we're sort of warming up to the topic. Okay, so where are we up to? Page 8. Dedications, just the 2 first verses. Gewadi no do dai lama sange rugyone trowa chi kyang mahaloha ne sala go pa shu jan chu sen chu rinpoche ma ke pa nam ge kuchi ke pa nyang pa me pa yang go ne gon du pa wa shu. The next page, prayer for the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. May you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And the prayer for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Peerless teacher, an assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge in infinite lands. Please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now, holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice. You wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparably venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the 3 jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And the long life prayer for Tenzin Zopa Rinpoche. Lord of Dharma, who in accordance with the various dispositions of those to be subdued, makes clear in the light of your well-spoken advice the sacred Ganden tradition, essence of Buddha's teachings. Foremost and holy Lama, to you are supreme. We make this prayer of supplication. Lama, please live. Okay, thank you very much. See you.